Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for your patience. The acknowledgement that registration is sometimes less than desirable. One of the problems today is that we have X number of seats projected on the basis of registrations, and then, as some of you know, we have people who did not register, certainly thought they did, and so I want to thank Moorings Park very much for being flexible in providing extra meals, and Serge, thank you very much. Danny, thank you. Serge is on the right. He's serving Sue, and I must say that Moorings Park is fabulous. Not only do they go the extra mile, as Serge has done today, and the rest of the wait staff, but the food is excellent, and they are so accommodating. So I know some of you are squeezed with 9 at a table versus 8. Thank you for your understanding. And when you go to register, you have to have a confirmation to show that your registration has gone through. If you have difficulty and you're not receiving a confirmation, send in an email on the information. Send in your email, and either the webmaster or John Levy will help. So please, I know sometimes we have absolute certainty about things, but as we age, absolute certainty increases and the reality decreases. So welcome. A couple of words about our last speaker, Dr. Martine Eksterman. I just want to raise a couple of issues that I think are important. One is some people miss content because of her accent, and just a reminder of a couple things she said. Number one, Moffitt is number 6 in the United States among cancer centers, which is pretty phenomenal. And one of the things we've learned through our committee is that the excellence at higher levels of academia is excellent in Florida. University of Florida, FSU in Tallahassee, UF in Gainesville, USF in Tampa. These are really fine institutions of higher learning. And the problem that we have is kindergarten through 12 is not as high a level as it needs to be. So what's happening is, I assume the legislature and the governor has decided that to get businesses to come into Florida, they want to make sure there are people who are college graduates who can step into these businesses as employees. I hope that they'll upgrade the pay and conditions. We're very fortunate in Collier County to have Cam Patton, who has raised Collier County to a high level in the face of many who English is not their primary language. So we're fortunate that Cam and the current school board is really terrific. And we have some terrific teachers. So we have every reason to continue to support Cam, the school board, and our teachers and our kids. Please turn off your cell phones. And we're very fortunate today that Bob Levy, who resides in Naples and in Moorings Park at Gray Oaks, and who has been chair of the Cato Institute, when we went to Bob for some help and suggestions, he suggested our speaker for today, Gene Healy. And Bob, as you may recall, if you've been around for a long time, has been a speaker to our group in years past, debated the tobacco issue in the past. And I told Bob this morning, not only did I say thank you, but also that our speaker, Gene Healy, when he spoke yesterday at FGCU, he did what Bob does, is that he did not take the comments from this older person personally, and was able to have a dialogue and diffuse the person's passion and anger and such, and left him standing. Bob does that, Gene does that. Bob I can understand because he's got about 25 years plus on Gene, but Gene I'm very impressed. So Gene grew up in northern New Jersey, went to Georgetown undergraduate school, and then went to University of Chicago for law school, which is a terrific law school, and has had a long-term interest in the issues that he's going to discuss today of presidential power. And he has been with Cato for 20 years. I've had the good fortune of being with him yesterday, a wonderful interview conversation on WGCU. He had a full house at FGCU yesterday, and it's been a real pleasure. So, Gene, please.
Steve, is this on? Oh, there we go. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Put it up a little bit. Oh yeah, that's better. How's that? Good? All right. I notice I can be normal or I can be Michael Bloomberg here. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me. My subject today is executive power and the role of the presidency, and it's studying this is a gift that just keeps on giving, I guess. If you listen to how presidents and presidential candidates talk about the office of the presidency, you might find yourself wondering, what kind of job is this supposed to be anyway? On the campaign trail in 2008, Barack Obama famously promised to stop the ocean's rise, end the age of oil in our time, and bend the very arc of history. In 2016, Donald Trump was a little less poetical and lyrical about it, but he would just say things like, "I alone can fix it," or at a mass rally in May that year, "I will give you everything. I'm the only one." In his opening statement at a Democratic debate this summer, Joe Biden announced, quote, "I'm running for president to restore the soul of this country." Is that all? You listen to how they talk about the office, and it's like somebody put up a want ad for megalomaniacal God Emperor of Earth. Not a public servant, not a chief executive officer of the federal government. Be that as it may, last summer, one of the 73 Democrats then currently running for president made a campaign promise that I could really get behind. A guy named Michael Bennet, he's the senior senator from Colorado. I had to look that up. And he said, "If you elect me president, I promise you won't have to think about me for 2 weeks at a time. You can go raise your kids and live your lives." And that was music to my ears. So of course, Bennett didn't even make it to New Hampshire. He succeeded only too well in being anonymous. But when you think about it, forgetting a president for 2 weeks at a time is in some ways as delusional a campaign promise as the idea that I'm going to give you everything or stop the ocean's rise. We can't forget about the president because the modern president is in charge of virtually everything. What your health insurance covers, who gets to enter the United States and who gets to stay, whether and when we go to war. He can add new names to the Predator drone kill list or start a trade war from his couch. I submit, unless and until the president's powers are reduced and responsibilities are reduced to something more like a constitutional scale, good luck forgetting the president. It's not just Donald Trump. Whoever has that office is going to be an omnipresent part of our lives. So that is my topic today, how we got here, how bad we've got it, and what, if anything, we can do about it. But first, in order to appreciate the monstrosity that the presidency has become, I think it helps to start with a look at the very different sort of institution it was designed to be. A look at what the framers of our Constitution had in mind for the federal chief executive officer. Today, you routinely hear people call the presidency things like the most powerful office in the world, leader of the free world. Most often, our first president, George Washington, used a much more humble title to refer to the office that he held. Washington called the presidency the office of the presidency the chief magistrate. The framers never envisioned the president as a leader of the free world, or even, in fact, as America's sole national leader. That was a dangerous notion. They were very skeptical about concentrating power in the hands, particularly of one human being. And the Federalist Papers literally begin and end with essays that warn about the dangers of popular leadership. In the first essay, first Federalist paper, John Jay warns that throughout history, those who have destroyed republics began by flattering the people. And in the last essay in the Federalist, Alexander Hamilton raises the specter of the military despotism of a victorious demagogue. The fact is that the framers didn't believe in what Teddy Roosevelt would later call the bully pulpit. They didn't think that the president had a right to command, to claim a special mandate from the people and pound the podium, go over the heads of Congress, and try to rally the masses behind his agenda and concentrate power. In fact, as hard as it may seem to imagine in the age of the reality show presidency, in the original scheme, the president was mostly supposed to keep his mouth shut. Early presidents gave very few public speeches. The State of the Union address, which is mandated in the Constitution, the president shall from time to time give Congress information on the State of the Union. The first two presidents, Washington and Adams, delivered that in front of Congress, and Jefferson thought that was too monarchical. It looked like a speech from the throne. So he inaugurated this tradition that lasted for some 120 years of just mailing it over, messengering it over in writing. And that tradition held until Woodrow Wilson came along and wrecked it, like he wrecked so many other things. President was supposed to keep his mouth shut most of the time, and his hands to himself. The constitutional powers that the framers gave the chief magistrate were mostly defensive. At home, he was mostly supposed to, the executive power was mostly the power to execute the laws. He was armed with a veto to be used to slap Congress back when it slipped its constitutional bonds. And abroad, of course, he had the power, he had defensive powers, the way the They talked about that at the Constitutional Convention, was in terms of repelling sudden attacks. But he was not conceived to have any power to launch sudden attacks or otherwise embroil the United States in a war without first getting authorization from Congress. All in all, what the framers designed is not a blueprint for what's often called a co-equal branch. People say that the presidency and Congress are co-equal branches. In fact, if you weigh up the powers given to each, Congress is dominant, at least on paper. It establishes the structure for the executive department and for the judiciary. It can create or abolish agencies. Through the impeachment power, it can remove judges, cabinet secretaries, and even the president. And the president has no reciprocal power to remove Congress, to touch members of Congress. He does have the power under Article 2, Section 3 to call Congress into session on extraordinary occasions so that they can tell him what to do. This is not a blueprint for a domineering presidency. The initial view was that in a Republican government, the legislative branch is dominant. And throughout the 19th century, with some exceptions, some hints of the presidency to come, for the most part, this was, in broad strokes, how things operated. In fact, in the late 19th century, the British academic and member of Parliament, Lord James Bryce, wrote an essay called "Why Great Men Are Not Chosen Presidents," trying to explain to a British audience why that was. And he says, in large part, it's the nature of the job. Englishmen assume that the American president ought to be a dazzling orator, able to sway legislatures or multitudes, but they forget, Bryce said, that the president does not sit in Congress, that he ought not to address meetings, that he cannot submit bills, nor otherwise influence the action of the legislature. His main duties are to be prompt and firm in securing the due execution of the laws and maintaining the public peace. 4/5 of his work is the same in kind as that which devolves on the chairman of a commercial company or the manager of a railway. That was the modest presidency we had going into the 20th century. So you might reasonably ask, what happened? How did we go from this humble chief magistrate to this gargantuan figure with full spectrum dominance over American life? And there's no one answer. Trying to find one answer is something like looking at one variable to explain America's obesity crisis. Are we fat because of high fructose corn syrup, or supersized portions, or because we watch on average 5 hours of TV a day? And the answer is yes, all of those things. The growth of the supersized presidency is much like that. You could write a whole book about the causes of it, given the time constraints. I'll just touch on a few factors that helped lead to the dominance of the executive branch. There's no doubt that America's rise to superpower status played a key role. There's the famous aphorism from Randolph Bourne, war is the health of the state, but he could just as easily have said that war is the health of the presidency. As America stepped out on the world stage, the chief magistrate increasingly became a domineering commander-in-chief. You could, of course, point to changes in broadcast technology. As you move from period in the 19th century where the main way to address a mass public is through newsprint and through radio. When you get radio and television, now social media, presidents acquired a sort of electronic bully pulpit that allowed them to directly communicate to the masses in a way that the framers seemed suspicious of. These are structural changes, economic changes, changes in international politics, but I think equally important are ideological changes, changes in the way that public intellectuals started to look at the presidency and what they thought the presidency was for. In that regard, you can blame a lot on the early 20th century progressives. They got this transformation started in some ways. They didn't want this modest law-executing chief magistrate. They wanted what one prominent progressive called a sledgehammer in the cause of national righteousness. That was the vision of the presidency. And they were openly contemptuous of the Madisonian system of checks and balances. Woodrow Wilson, who in addition to being one of our worst presidents, was a theorist of the presidency long before he took office. Wilson said that the framers had this, they thought as Newtonians. They had this structure of checks and balances where the government is opposed to itself, and action, reaction. You have different bodies repelling and checking each other. And Wilson said that, well, we're Darwinians, and we understand that the government should operate as a unified living organism. And of course, it should be directed from the head, and the head is the presidency. The progressives took advantage of three great crises, World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II, to fundamentally reshape the office. But the imperial presidency is a bipartisan creation, and I think conservatives get a great deal, should come in for a great deal of blame in how it's evolved as well. There's a defensible constitutional theory, you've probably heard of it, the unitary executive theory, which originally stood for the perfectly reasonable proposition that the president, whatever the executive powers that are granted in the Constitution, the president has all of them. He can fire his Secretary of State without, or FBI director without, consulting Congress. He can fire prosecutors, that sort of thing. After a fourth great crisis, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, unitary executive theory became shorthand for a much less defensible series of claims about the president's independent power to ignore validly enacted statutes by Congress restricting things like torture and surveillance. But the conservatives after 9/11 have a great deal to do with cementing this transformation into presidential dominance. Dick Cheney used to describe the Bush administration's mission as leaving the presidency stronger than we found it, and in that regard, mission accomplished. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't blame Congress. Congress is at the center of a lot of this transformation. In the book that popularized the term imperial presidency, that's Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s book from 1973, Schlesinger says that the growth of executive power in American history had been as much a matter of congressional abdication as presidential usurpation. You could even blame James Madison and some of the other framers who had a notion of ambition countering ambition, a notion that the separation of powers would be, in some sense, self-executing because everybody would have an interest, whether they were in Congress, the judiciary, or the executive branch, in maintaining their turf and protecting it from encroachments by the other branches. At least throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, that incentive structure has worked very well for the presidency. Presidents don't like to relinquish powers. They often seek greater powers in order to meet the demands that the public puts on the office. On the other hand, Congress is individual congresspeople are not so quick to defend their turf. Many of them that don't care about Congress's status as an institution or its prerogatives. So you tend to only see checks and balances operate in the way that they were intended to operate when you have Congress and the presidency in the hands of different parties. But the upshot of all of this is that the most powerful office in the world grew to that size during the 20th century and then grew vastly more powerful in the 21st. The Bush-Obama years in particular saw a radical transformation of presidential war power as both presidents stretched a 2001 congressional authorization that was aimed at al-Qaeda and the Taliban, perpetrators of 9/11, into a all-purpose blank check for permanent presidential war. All of that depressingly brings us up to Donald Trump. And where does he stand in all of this? Well, as I've suggested, he didn't invent the imperial presidency, he inherited it. It came with these vast war powers, thanks in part to the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, or AUMF. And it came with a host of other vast powers, many due to long-standing delegations of congressional power over trade, immigration, and the administrative state. What's he done with all that power? It turns out that's a tough question to figure out. And in part, it's a tough question to figure out because, look, love President Trump or hate him, whether you're on the left or the right, there's one thing we can all agree on, I think, which is that the guy is exhausting. His brand is crisis. It's the insult comic pep rallies, the Twitter Tourette's, everything at a relentless death metal pace. Every week is infrastructure week. Last fall, this is actually true, in a desperate attempt at self-care, I moved my iPhone off of my nightstand so that I'd actually be upright before I did my early morning "what fresh hell is this" check of the president's Twitter feed. And it's been so exhausting, so relentless, that it's hard to get a handle on what's genuinely new about, there's no doubt Trump has been an imperial president. Virtually every president in my lifetime has been an imperial president. The modern presidency is an imperial presidency. But because the ratio of noise to signal is so high, you need to focus to try to isolate what's genuinely new about Trump's imperial presidency compared to his predecessors, and what, in particular, I think this part is very important. What is genuinely new that will be passed on to new presidents? What innovations in the use of executive power has he contributed? Because he's not going to be our last president. Presidencies change hands and they change parties with some regularity, and that's why I think one of the things that drives me nuts is the short-term myopic take that a lot of people have on the growth of presidential power. So a lot of people, for example, cheering during the Obama administration when President Obama makes sweeping changes to immigration law, with the stroke of a pen, the pen in the phone. Seemingly not recognizing that the same, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and that he will be succeeded by someone else who may use those powers in ways that the Democratic Party didn't like. So with all of that, I took a look early last year, 2 years into the Trump presidency, about what was new and what wasn't. And there's a pattern where there's much more bark than bite. Trump tends to hit send tweet on crank theories of executive power and then not follow up with them. He will tweet out, I have the absolute right to pardon myself. And law professors and legal journalists cancel their weekend plans and hit the books trying to figure out, can you actually do that? Because nobody has actually, there's very little written on it because nobody has really thought seriously about that since Richard Nixon in the final days of Watergate, wandering around the halls of the White House drunk and talking to presidential portraits on the walls. And even he thought that was too crazy. So Trump does tend to tweet out or blurt out things like this and then not do them. And there's a lot of what has happened in the administration so far that is sort of standard imperial presidency stuff. Most of the war on terror stuff is just taking interpretations and expansions of the 2001 AUMF and ramping up the pace somewhat from where it was in Obama, plus a couple of drive-by bombings in Syria. This is up until the Soleimani strike, which I think is something quite different. But much of what Trump had done was just sort of right in the middle lane of imperial presidency stuff, despite the fact that the rhetoric and the public behavior was extremely different than past presidents. But there are a couple of important exceptions to this where I think that he has been, in a dangerous way, entrepreneurial with the use of power in ways that will be handed on to his successors. One of those is the use of a national security pretext for protectionism. This happened early on with his implementation of steel tariffs. Implementation of steel tariffs wasn't new. George W. Bush had done that, but he used a different provision of trade law. What Trump used was a provision from a Kennedy-era trade law that says that the president may adjust imports upon a finding by the Commerce Secretary that current levels threaten national security. And he did that to raise steel tariffs on the theory that Canadian steel and other imported steel was a national security threat. This is something that's in the law, but the provision had not been used in this manner before. It was just sort of laying there to be exploited, but most presidents since the passage of the law had been pro-trade, so they didn't seek to invoke it in this way. Since then, he has threatened to use this power to declare, imported cars a national security threat. It's an insanely broad delegation by Congress, and it turns out it wasn't particularly wise. Another similar area was just about a year old now, the declaration of a national emergency to do an end run around Congress to fund the border wall. The U.S. Code is larded with dozens and dozens, by one count, 123 some emergency powers that the president can invoke simply by declaring a national emergency. That's what he did in February of last year when Congress wouldn't pony up enough for his border wall. And the declaration of a national emergency was not new. We're now under 30-some consecutive or concurrent declarations of national emergency, some of them dating back to 1979. So that this is sort of par for the course. You might wonder how much of an emergency is it if there are 30-some going on at the same time that we're mostly unaware of. But what Trump did was invoke a provision in a statute called the Military Construction Codification Act in order to to get the money to shift from one Pentagon account to another to build the border wall. This particular statute was just designed in a time of war or near war to allow the president some flexibility with where he's building bases or what particular construction projects are needed now without having to go back to Congress. It had been invoked twice before, once by George Bush the elder in the run-up to the Gulf War, and once by his son after 9/11, both in sort of the way that the statute was designed to be used. It seems never to have occurred to any prior president, though, that you could just use it to do an end run around Congress and exercise a sort of presidential power of the purse when you didn't get what you wanted in a budget fight. And that's what Trump did. And as I said, there are many more emergency powers that could be exploited in that way. He referenced one of those statutes last summer when he issued a tweet saying, our great American companies are hereby ordered to immediately start looking for an alternative to China, including bringing your companies home and making your products in the USA. Then when the haters laughed at him, he said, try looking at the Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. Case closed. He's not entirely wrong. It's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. But this is a law that presidents have used to declare national emergencies and impose sanctions on various rogue actors in the international community. It's been overused. But if you look at it on its face, it's not crazy to say that you could use this to order companies out of China. And that's a staggering amount of power for one individual to have. It turns out that Democratic candidates for presidency had been listening. Elizabeth Warren, around the time of Trump's emergency declaration, tweeted out that gun violence is an emergency, climate change is an emergency, Donald Trump's ridiculous wall is not an emergency. Now, I happen to think she's right about the last part, but she really sounds kind of entranced by the possibilities of rule by decree, the pen and the phone. And it turns out that a lot of those 120 some emergency powers can be used in ways that I think conservatives would find appalling. There's a University of California, Berkeley law professor who took a look at this and in terms of what emergency powers could be used for climate change. He found that you could shift billions in Pentagon funds to subsidize renewable energy and solar panels and impose new restrictions on automobile use and maybe use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act against companies or countries trafficking in fossil fuels. So heck of a job, Donald. He's given a whole bunch of good ideas to Berkeley law professors, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And I think you see a lot of this popping up in Democratic debates now and in some of the Democratic candidates' campaign positions. There was a poll, to come back to the myopia, I think, that surrounds a lot of our debate over executive power. There was a poll published a few months back by the Pew Research Center that showed that the longer Donald Trump has been in office, the more Republican voters have warmed up to the idea of unchecked presidential power. A year after his inauguration, a healthy 70% of Republicans said that they agreed with the statement that it would be too risky to give U.S. presidents more power to deal directly with many of the country's problems. Now, barely half say that. But more staggering, I think, is they also looked at self-identified conservatives. And a majority now of self-identified conservatives think it would be swell if, quote, presidents didn't have to worry so much about Congress or the courts. It's not what I think of as a conservative viewpoint, and I think it will change pretty rapidly when the presidency changes hands. But it would be nice if we thought about these things with a longer time horizon. Because people who are answering the poll that way are kidding themselves if they think that the sword that Donald Trump has forged can't be used against them. So having set out the problem, I guess I'm supposed to provide a solution, but my time is up. So I really should cut the short so we can get to the questions, but I'll just wrap it up quickly and leave you with this, and maybe we can get into more of the details in some of the questions. When you think about all the power and responsibility that Congress has ceded to the presidency over the years, in a way it's not surprising that the public holds Congress as an institution in such low esteem. I'm not suggesting that people are actually thinking this when they answer polls. They're not thinking, I hate how much power Congress delegates to the president. That's not a conscious thing. But I think that the long decline in respect for Congress occurs contemporaneously with this process of Congress making itself more and more irrelevant. My favorite illustration of this was from a sort of smart-ass poll that this group, Public Policy Polling, did a few years back. When they asked voters to rank Congress versus a whole host of horrible things, which do you like better? And Congress scored lower, was less popular than traffic jams, NFL replacement refs, head lice, colonoscopies, Nickelback, and even Washington, D.C. political pundits, which is a surprise to me. But Congress retains all of the powers that I talked about at the outset. On paper, at least, Congress's potential to claw back these powers, if it could act in a unified manner, is there. There's a law professor, Charles Black, who, when he was writing in the wake of Watergate about some of these issues, said, "My classes think I am trying to be funny when I say that Congress could reduce the president's staff to one secretary and put the White House up at auction, but these things are literally true. And if Congress has the legal power to sell the White House, it has the power to rein in presidential emergency powers, defund unauthorized uses of power, and reclaim the power to make the laws that Americans have to follow." One thing that you hope, and I think there is some reason to be mildly optimistic on positive developments in this direction, is that like the prospect of a hanging, Donald Trump has tended to concentrate the mind wonderfully on the amount of power that we've built up in this branch and whether that's a good idea. And there is more movement and interest on both sides of the aisle on these issues now on Capitol Hill than there has been for as long as I've been interested in these issues. So that doesn't take the ball across the goal line, but it's at least a start. That when you have people on both sides of the presidential race who are either abusing power or bragging about their plans to abuse power, it helps us stumble towards what ought to be a totally obvious insight, that if people so transparently likely to abuse power can come within striking distance of the presidency, then maybe it was a bad idea to concentrate all this much power in the office in the first place, and we should start doing something about that. Well, thank you for your attention, and be happy to take any questions.
First of all, thank you very much, and thank you, Bob. So I don't think we could have found a more timely subject. And what I learned over the last 24 hours is that Gene has taken away the noise and allowed us to focus on the signal. And I said last night at dinner that I was in the control booth when you were interviewed by WGCU yesterday afternoon, and I watched the oscilloscope. And the oscilloscope was recording voices, and I saw there were peaks and valleys and peaks and valleys, but your answers were in the middle, and so that was very impressive. So we'll start. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is absolutely terrific talk, and I'm sure that there'll be many, many questions. I just wanted to interject a historical note which shows just exactly how prescient you are in raising these. And that is during the War of 1812, a future president, James Monroe, wrote to a previous president, Thomas Jefferson, about the present president, James Madison, who was desperately ill with malaria in the White House. And Monroe is complaining to, or outlining to Thomas Jefferson the problems facing the presidency in a situation where the Senate and Congress are tying up every bit of legislation that the president is trying to get through, including some that have to do with the war powers, and talking about the inability of the president and the possibility that Congress would abrogate the separation of powers and the equal delegation of powers. So it just struck me that we're dealing with something that has now totally flipped in a sense that, but that the framers of the, not the framers, the writers of the Federalist Papers both saw and sort of feared. But thank you very much. I'm sure we're going to have plenty of great questions.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I have to look
I'm
up
over
that
here.
letter.
So I have a question for you over here, sir. You talk about in your polling how the Republicans have gotten more accustomed to the unitary president. But in addition, when Attorney General Barr, prior to looking to become Attorney General, he wrote this long memo about the unitary president at that point in time. And it seems to me at this juncture that most of the individuals in the administration, in the institutions, have sort of all bought in to the concept of a Unitarian president. So what are the gatekeepers to prevent the Unitarian president to go overboard and do whatever he wants under any set of circumstances?
That's a great question. So I think that, I might have hinted before, I think there's a version of what's called unitary executive theory, a narrower version that is perfectly defensible. And in fact, that's sort of the way, this is a theory that came out of the Federalist Society and the Reagan Justice Department that, the Constitution gives the president all the executive power. So whatever the executive power is, he has it. He has the whole thing. Initially, this meant that he could ride herd on overzealous regulators because he's the head of the executive branch. He can rein in some administrative agencies. It appears in the arguments against the independent counsel statute in a famous dissent that Justice Scalia wrote in a case called Morrison versus Olson, where on these grounds he argues against having functionally independent and unfireable prosecutors in the executive branch, because that is, if the president has the executive, the whole of the executive power, this traduces his power. I think those narrow claims have a lot to be said for them. I don't think they're maybe as strong as some of the advocates of unitary executive theory think they are, but I think they're very defensible. It expanded, as I said, after 9/11 into a whole host of claims about what laws the president has to follow. And it doesn't seem to me that because the president can fire his FBI director, it means he can wake up tomorrow morning and nuke North Korea without any consultation with Congress. But I think what President Trump has revealed, I was speaking with Bob about this just I don't know, 40 minutes ago at lunch. What President Trump has showed, I think, is even the narrow version of that theory, that the president is the boss of the executive branch, the boss of the chief law enforcement officer, things like that. How much that depended on informal norms, because if the president is functionally the chief law enforcement officer in the country, we don't want a president to use the full power of the Department of Justice, because he's boss of prosecutors, to reward his cronies and punish his political enemies. That would be terrifying, right? Especially if you don't think it's terrifying, then imagine, reverse the political polarity and imagine somebody you can't stand having that power. It's just, it's appalling. So presidents were restrained in, at least in public, in directly interfering with ongoing prosecutions, mouthing off about ongoing prosecutions. Scooter Libby, when he was prosecuted, George W. Bush considered pardoning him, but didn't pardon him. Clearly he has the power to pardon whoever he wants, but he thought it would look bad politically. And there are a host of norms that grew up around the presidency and were strengthened after Watergate about what, regardless of what the legal authorities are, what is proper to do. And Trump, in his bull in the china shop, erratic, spastic way, is showing how important that set of norms and informal restraints has been. And, as I say, if anyone who's okay with this, given the current political environment, should just imagine the presidency in the hands of somebody, well, let's say less scrupulous or as unscrupulous as Donald Trump, and a lot more competent.
No.
I can't.
Thank you for your comments. You talked about what presidents leave to future presidents for initiatives or orders they may undertake, and this president is using executive orders and acting cabinet secretaries not to go through Congress. What is this president leaving to future presidents and Congresses when the members are acting in such a partisan manner and they're afraid to compromise and work together in a bipartisan way because they're fearful of re-election? And so there's this fear of not getting any money Therefore, nothing is done, and not much has been accomplished by this president. So what would you say about that initiative that he's leaving for future presidents?
The vacancies thing or in general?
Just in general, it's the
Okay.
vacancies, it's the acting secretaries,
Yeah.
it's the executive orders when Congress won't pass a
Sure.
law. And you said Congress has more authority than the president, but they're not using their authority because they're scared. And I think this may be the first time that a president is holding over members of his own party. If you speak against me or do something I don't want, you won't be reelected.
Yeah, well, it is an enormous problem. So there are members of the Republican Party that are concerned about some of these issues, but they are scared to stick their necks out too much. So you did see, it was just about a year ago, the emergency declaration at the border. In the vote to overturn that, to repeal the president's decision to shift this money unlawfully to building the border wall, Congress has under the National Emergencies Act, the ability to try to rescind an emergency declaration, which is kind of upside down, but a dozen, I think, or maybe one or two more Republicans crossed the aisle to vote against, to vote to repeal Trump's border wall emergency. And that was actually a surprise to people that 12, as many as 12, when you know that probably a majority of them think this is a bad idea. You had, there was last week, a War Powers resolution initiative to restrain President Trump from further hostilities with Iran. 8 Republicans, including some of his fairly hardcore supporters, crossed the aisle to vote against that. But you're right that they're scared not so much of him, indirectly of him. It's not that he's going to have them prosecuted, but he can tweet about how they're anti-Trump, and their own constituents will punish them. And I think that's a tough problem to deal with, because I think there is quite a bit more interest among Republicans on reforming emergency powers, say, than 12 of 53 Senate Republicans, than that vote indicates. It's hard to know what to do about that in the short term. The last really significant period of congressional resurgence and new restraints imposed on the presidency was in the wake of Watergate. So Congress, the post-Watergate Congresses went beyond just, getting rid of Richard Nixon or forcing him out of office effectively to do things like the Impoundment Control Act, the War Powers Resolution, strengthening the Freedom of Information Act, a whole host of framework statutes that started to put executive power back in its box. Well, Donald Trump's still around. He's going to veto a lot of these and will take offense and, punish people politically to the extent that they're framed as attacks on Trump rather than, improvements in the way we do emergency powers and war powers. So, I wish I had that's why I tried to cut off the part of the speech where I talk about solutions.
So I think in the 20th century, there were 2 changes we made that fundamentally changed our government and the presidential office. And the first one was the 17th Amendment to the Constitution in 1913, changing the way we elect U.S. senators. Prior to 1913, the state legislatures chose the 2 U.S. senators, and our founders did that purposely to check the federal government and to keep power in the states. And when we changed that, all of a sudden, those who ran for office, including the president, have tremendous incentive to play Santa Claus with the public treasury and credit. And so the power of government and the power of the presidency grew. And the second one was with in the 1930s, with the reinterpretation of the General Welfare Clause. Rather than the 8 limited powers that the Constitution gave the federal government, all of a sudden it got involved in every part of our lives. So as we made those 2 very significant changes, what Washington does grew exponentially and has ever since, as has the power of the presidency. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I agree with you on those two changes, and the relationship with government growth in those cases is direct. And you know, for instance, the 17th Amendment and the demise of federalism. I think there's an absolutely direct link. The senators were initially supposed to be sort of ambassadors from the state to the federal government. Once they were directly elected, popularly elected, that sort of independence and that conception of the office went away and became easier to centralize power. They're less directly related, though I think they bear some important relation to the concentration of power horizontally in one branch, you know, the presidency vis-a-vis Congress. Although I think there is a good argument to be made that the more you centralize power in the federal government, the more that power, I think they're symbiotic. As the federal government becomes responsible for a much broader range of goods and services and even, you know, spiritual benefits, you know, curing the national malaise. This, as all power focuses to the central government, it also tends to rest in a central figure. So I think those 2 constitutional erosions were at least instrumental in the centralization of power in Washington, and maybe directly, you know, indirectly contributed heavily to the centralization of power in the executive branch.
Would you comment on the president's ability to direct assassinations?
So, yes, I think that most of what Donald Trump had done up until January 2nd of this year in terms of war powers was right in the middle lane of post 9/11 imperial presidents. You know, it wasn't, it was George W. Bush and particularly Barack Obama who expanded the initial authorization, the 2001 AUMF, beyond, you know, what it was originally intended to target, which was the perpetrators of 9/11 and anyone who harbored them. It was Bush and Obama who through creative lawyering and interpretation, made that into a blank check for presidential war. And Trump had just, as I suggested, just sort of ramped up the pace of drone strikes somewhat from where Obama left it. I think the thing he did that's genuinely new and perhaps crosses a constitutional Rubicon is the Soleimani killing. And, you know, right, this is where you're supposed to acknowledge he's a terrible guy and nobody should miss him. He's a terrible guy and nobody should miss him. That's not relevant to whether this was a constitutional innovation or a good idea. You had this whole apparatus of targeted killing that Presidents Bush and Obama built up. But that was directed mostly against stateless, terrorists, suspected terrorists, people with limited ability to strike back. Trump, in the Soleimani killing, directed that apparatus, the machinery that Obama handed him the keys to, against a senior government figure of a foreign country. It strikes me that that is very problematic. It is, I'd argue, not within the president's defensive powers. Certainly the president has the power to repel sudden attacks. He doesn't have to get Congress on the line to shoot back when a military base is being attacked, nor even if there is actual intelligence on an impending attack. I don't think we need to interpret that power in so narrow a way that his hands are tied unless there's an AUMF or a declaration of war. That said, this is the first time that an American president has openly and publicly ordered the killing of a senior government figure for a country with which we're not at war, not legally at war. There have been in the past, it's not the first time we've killed or tried to kill a senior government official. We killed Admiral Yamamoto in World War II. That was a declared war. Congress had authorized it, and he was a fair target. George W. Bush tried and failed to kill Saddam Hussein in the opening days of the Iraq War. There was a decapitation strike aimed at wiping out Hussein, but the intel was bad. But again, legitimate target in a war that Congress authorized. We have no AUMF that covers Iran, and this was, it's fair to say any country would have recognized, certainly we would consider it effectively a declaration of war if, say, Vladimir Putin killed our CIA director because we're giving Javelin missiles to the Ukraine. It seems to me this is not within the president's independent constitutional powers, which are defensive in war powers. I think it could be quite dangerous.
Is this on now? Yeah, okay. Two brief points come to mind from your talk, which I'm very grateful for your talk. First, the language of the Constitution that outlines the right of pardon to the president is very, very brief. Do the Federalist Papers talk about any limitations? Second, you described the continuing arrogation of power through the executive order. Is that constitutionally justified, and or how has it managed to evolve to this point?
Sure. So the pardon power was sweeping. I think it was designed to be sweeping. When Hamilton writes about it in the Federalist Papers, he acknowledges that. And one of I'm forgetting the archaic kind of language, something about justice not wearing a face that is so sanguinary and cruel. It was designed in part to soften the blow of the application of law in deserving cases. So, the president can't grant pardons for state crimes. He can't easily, anyway, grant pardons for acts that have not yet been committed. But he doesn't have to wait for indictments or anything like that. That's how Nixon was pardoned. They also talked about it as a tool of blanket pardons. Hamilton talks about as a tool to sort of, tamp down dissent. That's what Washington did in the Whiskey Rebellion. Sort of cooled off. He granted pardons to a broad class of offenders. So they envisioned it being used in that way. They also recognized that it could be abused. And there's a discussion at the Virginia ratifying convention between George Mason and James Madison, where Mason says, well, what if the president, in effect, what if the president, pardons people for crimes which he has himself advised? And Madison says, well, if he does that, we have the power of impeachment, and he can be impeached for that. So the idea that the president's defense team was pushing, that abuse of power is not an impeachable offense, or not an impeachable offense without an actual felony, is total nonsense. Abuse of power is the core impeachable offense, and in part, the framers recognized that because they knew in things like the pardon power, they'd given the president sweeping powers. It's not actually illegal for, if he wants to pardon Don Jr. and Roger Stone and, whoever he wants, it's hard to see what criminal laws are violated by that. He has that power. But the check on that abuse of power, as they saw it, was, all right, we can impeach and remove you. As far as executive orders go, executive orders is one of those things like signing statements, I think, where the devil's in the details. I don't object to, so there, depending on how you classify them, there are executive orders from the Washington administration. There's no problem with a presidential directive provided that it has constitutional and or statutory authority behind it. In fact, if you look at, sometimes people do this analysis of, such and such a president issued, 500 executive orders, whereas Donald Trump only issued X hundred, but counting them up in the Federal Register is not a good way to go about this. Some of the executive orders are like, there's one that happens where it's like federal employees get half a day off on Christmas Eve. It gets counted in executive, and that's not quite like Japanese internment, right? Like, so you really have to look at individual executive orders, and some of the things that we think of as executive orders are talked to, they have a different classification. I think the travel ban was a Homeland Security directive or a presidential memorandum. So in general, executive orders, as not as a technical term, but as a shorthand for unilateral presidential orders, yeah, I mean, that's what a lot of this debate is about. And like I say, some of them are objectionable and some are innocuous, but there has been a long-term historical trend away from executive orders that are simply administrative within the power of the federal government affecting the executive branch towards executive orders that effectively make law. And those are the kind that ordinary citizens have to follow, and those are the kind that I think are more problematic.
Commented that when Bill Clinton was impeached, members of his party indicated that what he did was wrong, even though they did not vote for impeachment, as opposed to this time around, members of the party did not. Lamar Alexander commented, was Lamar Alexander correct in the face of impeachment not being possible to get a 2/3? Is he from a practical standpoint correct that the way to do it is to have the people vote?
Is he correct in In what sense? In voting to,
Recognizing that impeachment is not going to happen because of the two-thirds requirement, so that it's up to the people to vote in or out.
well, I think there were good arguments for voting to acquit in the impeachment trial. And there are also bad arguments. So impeachment is, people like to say it's all politics, and I can completely understand why people say that. But in my view, it's a mixed operation of law and politics, and what the constitutional meaning of high crimes and misdemeanors is important and should be observed. But there's a whole part of prudential questions that the constitutional law doesn't tell you anything about. So I think it's a perfectly defensible argument to say what Trump did in the phone call was bad, may have been a high misdemeanor, but in an election year, it is too dramatic to remove him from office and take him off the ballot. There's no legal answer to that argument. That's not a legal argument. It's a prudential argument. And I think it would be a perfectly defensible justification for a senator's vote to acquit. Or a senator could say, I think what he did clearly was bad. I don't think he was trying to drain the swamp in the Ukraine. But it's not enough to justify removing the president in an election year and taking him off the ballot. I think they were, for some of the reasons that we talked about, President Trump's sort of the influence with the base, they were a good deal more timid than that, if you look at the speeches explaining the Senate votes. Now, when Bill Clinton was acquitted, and all Democrats in the Senate voted to acquit him, he had no chance to claim vindication because the vote could not have been interpreted as it's totally okay to lie in court about a sexual affair. It was a perfect fling. None of that, because the Senate speeches by the Democrats voting to acquit are just full of invective about how deplorable, irresponsible, reprehensible, et cetera, Clinton's behavior was. Now, whether that was sincere or not, I assume in some cases it was sincere, and in other cases it certainly wasn't. The public message of that was not, hey, there's a new standard for what presidents can get away with. The message in the Senate speeches of Republicans who voted to acquit is much more mixed, much more timid. You have Lamar Alexander says it's inappropriate. Susan Collins said it was bad judgment. Ben Sass, who's like the new Bill Bennett lecturing Americans about virtue half the time, says it was not a perfect call. And most Republicans dodged the question. Now, look, it seems to me that whether you think on that grounds alone a president should be removed from office, what was clearly going on in that phone call and in the holdup of military aid was an attempt to, as John Dean put it in a famous enemies list memo, use the available political machinery to screw our political enemies. There is not a universe in which Donald Trump is exceptionally concerned with draining the swamp in the Ukraine, and it just so happens that in a neutral assessment of what are the big corruption problems facing Ukraine, it's the fact that Joe Biden's ne'er-do-well son is getting this giant kickback. It turns up in the top three. He's was trying basically what the Nixon administration was trying to do when they tried to get the McGovern campaign audited. You know, maybe some of these people cheated on their taxes, but they're clearly trying to damage a political enemy. Maybe that's not something you remove the president for in an election year, but it also seems to me that, you know, if Hillary Clinton had stayed as Secretary of State when she was running against Donald Trump, and it came out that she asked a foreign leader who was expecting foreign aid to gin up an investigation into Trump's international business interests, I do not think that the answer from Republicans would be move along, nothing to see here. So it seems to me the Senate Republicans should have acknowledged all that, and you could make an intellectually defensible, respectable, even honorable decision to say, okay, we're not going to remove him for that, but let's not say it's open season on foreign investigations of your political opponents, because, I mean, you almost want to see Elizabeth Warren. Well, what's everyone going to say when Elizabeth Warren starts, you know, if Elizabeth Warren became president and started doing this against the Trump kids' international business interests? It's just, it strikes me as what went on is certainly not on the scale of Watergate, that one instance, but it certainly rhymes with Watergate at least, and people should have acknowledged that.
I have a somewhat different kind of question. I don't think there's any question that this administration and its leader are anti-science. They seem dedicated to reducing their commitment to a variety of different fields of science. The climate changes are just the tip of the iceberg and withdrawing from the Paris Accords. He's also, the president has tried to get massive decreases in the budgets of the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. He's recommended decreases in water control and eventual elimination of the Environmental Protection Agency. He's stopped the influx, if at all possible, of foreign postdocs, which are critical to the research establishment in this country. To some extent, I guess Congress can ameliorate this. Are there any other safeguards or stop points that can restore some of the activity in these fields?
Well, I mean, certainly, you know, in terms of executive power, the president can recommend what he wants in terms of spending. And some of these may be bad policies, but, you know, again, the devil may be in the details, but it seems to me that things we argue about, you know, in Congress and in public, and it doesn't seem to me that it's an abuse of executive power specifically to do any of these things. He's got different policy priorities, and you know, some of them may be misguided. Personally, I'm a libertarian, so I'm for small government, but I guess maybe NIH isn't the first place I'd cut in the middle of the coronavirus or CDC. So, you know, I think these are not imperial presidency sort of issues. They're a different set of issues that, you know, on which he may have some bad views and that sort of thing. That's how I would address that.
I would like to get back, is this on?
Yes. Yep.
I'd like to get back to two things about Congress and what their role is. They are to pass laws, but the regulators in office, the regulators then develop much of the implementing regulations and are in fact creating law, and the Congress is not going back and reviewing that, and you didn't comment on that. The second thing is related to that. Have you read the book License to Lie? And the reason I mention it, I just heard somebody speak on the abuse of prosecutorial activities within the Justice Department and across the country, and that may be another area that why there is criticism by the Republicans and conservatives that you alluded to. Only their position has changed over the years, because there's some evidence that we need to be looking at what is going on with prosecutorial abuse. And that is all under the presidential powers. Can something be done about, does something need to be done about that? And this is the reduction of everything under Congress.
Well, on the first point, delegation of power and administrative regulations, yeah, I didn't spend much time on that, but it's an important issue. It is how we ended up with a swollen executive branch in many ways. Congress has all legislative power, and so the things that carry criminal penalties that coerce and prohibit ought to be things that were voted on by Congress. Too often what happens in modern legislation, however, is something, there's a law professor, Gary Lawson, who uses a metaphor of, it's like Congress set up a goodness and niceness commission. And with the implementing statute that said, make all laws related to goodness and niceness, regulations related to goodness and niceness. And the direction in the actual law does not, it's a wholesale delegation of lawmaking power to an agency that's in the in the executive branch. And there's a way in which the regulatory state is made up of multiple, in effect, goodness and niceness commissions, because there are multiple cases of people who are actually, go to jail for violations of regulations that were not, they're not passed, ruled upon by Congress. One way to get back at some of that, there have been framework statutes proposed, like the REINS Act. I forget exactly Bob probably knows, but everything's an acronym now in Congress. But the REINS Act, in effect, for major legislation that's expected to impose $100 million or more costs, that the regulations that are proposed, Congress has to have an up or down vote on those regulations, those rulemakings, rather than try to delegate all the authority of the executive branch in the first place and try to repeal what is effectively an administrative-made law, in which case, it's one of the ways in which that process, in a lot of ways, the lawmaking process in this and other areas has been turned upside down, because Congress delegates power, or the executive has the power to move first, and then all of the roadblocks that the framers designed to stand in the way of hasty lawmaking then become roadblocks in the effort to repeal bad law. So we have bicameral legislature, and the president has veto power, because the notion was you ought to have a lot of consensus before we pass a major law. You ought to have a lot of consensus before we go to war. Now, if the executive branch can effectively make the decision over war, if the regulatory state can effectively implement the law, all of those obstacles stand in the way of doing anything about it. And so I think the delegation is it's at the heart of a lot of these problems. In terms of prosecutorial abuse, I don't know the book. I don't, certainly prosecutorial abuse is rampant. And It's certainly possible that, well, in fact, more than possible that a reforming president could do something about that. But the way that would be done would be at the top level in guidances that apply to DOJ procedures across the run of cases. You don't start doing, people were right that the sentencing guidelines, the second sentencing recommendation for Roger Stone was too high. The judge, who has no love lost for Roger Stone, said as much. But you don't do criminal justice reform at the level of your cronies. You don't you don't say there's prosecutorial abuse or sentencing. People are getting, the sentencing recommendations are out of line with what they actually did. You don't do that when it's for your buddy, because it's happening to countless other people. So if you want to reform that process, Congress, of course, could step in. But even within the executive branch, that can be reformed. But it's not reformed to say, this guy I know, that's my buddy, he was getting a raw deal, and do nothing much about how that system operates across the board.
The book came out in 2014. It has nothing to do with this.
Yeah, but this is a good example.
Yeah.
Recently, two members of Congress and John Kerry visited I don't know if it's prime minister or someone who is tied to, at an executive level, with someone in Iran. They did not, I believe the procedure is such that you have to register with the State Department if you're going to make those kinds of visits. That didn't happen, and I'm curious, I think it would be a Logan Act issue. I was wondering if you'd have any comments on it. One, I know that it has never been tested for members of Congress, but John Kerry is not a member of Congress, and John Kerry certainly, as Secretary of State, knew better than to do something like this. Any thoughts, any comments?
It's been a long time since I looked at the Logan Act. I've seen it being criticized for overbreadth, I'm not sure it says anything about the procedures in the State Department. Maybe those are administrative regulations. Of course, Rand Paul met with the foreign minister of Iran, presumably, I think, with Trump's knowledge. But I don't think it works the way it should work.
You have to register to do such a thing. You can do it, but
So then it wouldn't be the Logan Act, it'd be whatever the implementing I don't know, I gotta tell you, the only time I ever hear about the Logan Act is when one side or the other wants to throw the book at somebody who didn't want, who either doesn't like the other party that is engaged in this activity or doesn't want anyone negotiating with that country. So, like I say, I don't know a lot about it, but the way it comes up generally is not, does not make me think it's a big issue.
I want to thank Gene Healy, Bob Levy, and all of you for your good questions and your paying attention to what obviously has been and continues to be a very important issue for our country. Gene, thank you.
Thank you.
Young four-year.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.